Hello to the AI4EU Cafe today with the speaker Olga, Hamama, and with a talk on EU AI policies and regulation. How can SMEs and startups test the trustworthiness of the AI applications? As you see, Olga's there. Hi, Olga. This is important. My name is Carmen McWilliams, and I'm the moderator and organizer of this cafe. I'm the director of the company Grassroots Arts and partner in the European AI4EU project. And as always, in the beginning, I'll tell you a little bit the rules of the cafe. Please take notice that the session will be recorded. No confidential information shall be shared in this cafe session. In this cafe, the speaker expresses her personal view and opinion. This is not necessarily the official AI4EU project opinion. And what's the web cafe about? It's always a place where you gain insight into the European AI scene. Participants get the chance to share knowledge, experiences, and meet stakeholders from various areas of AI research and application. And welcome everybody in this cafe. Thank you, you're all there. It's great to have this big public today. And be aware that it's interactive. We are looking forward for your questions. Please write in your questions in the menu. There's a chat and question menu. Please, I will read them, and after the presentation, I will read them to Olga, and Olga may answer them. So now we're coming to the main point, to our great speaker. I'm proud to present Olga Hamama. She is from V29 Legal. Duve, Hamama, Rechtsanwaelte, PartG. This is basically a legal company from Germany. And Olga Hamama, now her short bio. Olga Hamama is an international dispute resolution lawyer with a specific focus on climate change and technology-related matters. Olga acts as arbitrator, co-counsel, and is also advising clients on regulatory and policy-related matters regarding artificial intelligence. Olga is a member of the Silicon Valley Arbitration and Mediation Center and is AI legal at the German AI Association. So welcome, Olga, again. Thank you that you are joining us today. And I will now hand you the moderation, and you can introduce yourself, your talk, and as you like. Great that you're here. So now it's up to you.
Thank you very much, Carmen. I hope you can all hear me and see me well. We have a ray of light in Frankfurt, so I moved to my kitchen table from my desk. I hope that's fine for you as well. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Carmen, for the invitation. I followed a couple of sessions already of AI4EU Cafe and enjoyed it very much. Thank you very much to the audience as well for showing up and being brave enough and showing interest to listen to me. So Carmen asked me about the topic I could address, and I thought that in view of the current developments on the EU level and the upcoming emerging AI regulatory framework, it would be good to talk about the status of the framework and also address the question, how can small and medium-sized enterprises and startups especially test the trustworthiness of their AI applications while they're waiting for clarity in terms of the upcoming EU regulation. So this is going to be our topic today. Carmen has already presented me briefly. I am coming from a dispute resolution background, and it was 2 years ago that I decided to pay more attention specifically to the topics related to AI and climate change. The emerging AI regulatory framework, at least at the EU level, of course, played a great role in terms of timing and my interest in the area. So let us dive in. What would I like to talk to you about today? I understand from Carmen that, first of all, the audience is multidisciplinary and also very international. So at the beginning, I would like to talk to you about the status quo in terms of AI regulations and policies worldwide. And then we will get to the European level specifically, just to understand the context, the overall context and the global context. I would briefly touch about the topic of significance of transparency and explainability of AI in particular, address existing regulations and possible gaps in those regulations. And then finally, I will come to specific suggestions how companies can assess trustworthiness of their AI applications based on their information we've see until then and tools available at the moment. So let us dive in, and please feel free to ask questions as we go. I will be presenting and will be happy to answer all the questions afterwards, or if that suits, even during the presentation. So it's up to you, Carmen. So the first chapter will address the global status quo. Where do we stand right now? So talking about the regulatory trends, right, it's important to understand first that, of course, the global community as such understood the tremendous potential that AI as technology has in terms of its societal and economic benefits. At the same time, we hear from various players that these benefits are also connected to potential risks related to the development, usage, and deployment of AI. During the last year, we've seen big players in the field, such as IBM's, Google, and Facebook, for example, banning facial recognition, or Amazon banning facial recognition technologies. The whole discussion arose in the midst of the racial conflicts in the US. And in the context of these developments, two main trends can be identified really worldwide. The first being increased self-regulation, and the second being emerging public regulations coming from governments in various countries on various levels. So looking at the regulatory trends globally, it is important to say that since 2017, we've seen a great number of AI principles being introduced by big corporations on the one hand, and on the other hand by various non-profit organizations, non-governmental or governmental organizations. And some of them may well play a role as models for upcoming legislative acts, or even became already role models for some legislative acts in various jurisdictions worldwide. There is out of this proliferation of AI principles, one can also distill a number of principles which are recognized on a global scale, and we will have a closer look into those principles later on. I mean, we've seen in recent years a number of organizations suggesting AI principles for ethical AIs. At the beginning, like in May 2019, OECD member countries approved a number of recommendations on AI, stressing in this context that AI should be based on the principles of inclusive growth, sustainable development and well-being, human-centered values and fairness, transparency and explainability, robustness, security and safety, as well as accountability. These principles have been later on also adopted and reinforced by G20 in Japan. Here I would like to draw your attention as well, to those of you specifically interested in this topic, to a research which has been conducted under the species of Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at the Harvard University. And this study analyzed 36 AI principles which have been introduced starting in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, and analyzed many of them and tried to distill common principles, which, analyzing all those different documents and principles introduced by various again, players in the field, non-governmental organizations, governmental organizations, or corporations even. And interestingly, one could say that on the global scale, there were 8 key trends relating to privacy, accountability, safety, security, again, transparency and explainability, fairness and non-discrimination, human control of technology, professional responsibility, and promotion of human values. Keeping these principles in touch, I would also briefly like to touch upon the developments in China and in the United States. Why is it so? Because obviously, if you start reading about the topic of artificial intelligence and the global developments, quite often it is spoken about the global race of AI superpowers, the leading to being China and the United States, and the European Union, well, paving its own way in this global race and trying to position itself in between these two powers. So speaking about China, it is very interesting to note, at least it was very interesting for me, that it was already back in July 2017 that China's State Council released the country's strategy for developing AI, which was entitled New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan. So this plan was based on 3 main objectives. First of them being becoming the world leader in AI by 2030. Second, also a very important one, is the monetization of AI and the funding for the industry was amounted to, the planned funding amounted to a trillion yuan, which is 150 billion US dollars. And the third objective was the emerging as the driving force in defining ethical norms and standards for AI. So it seems to be that China, although very often like being overshadowed maybe by perception of the Western world in terms of its approach to ethical norms and standards for AI, set already its path back in 2017 in this context. And then the white paper on AI followed in 2018. And in June 2019, 8 principles were introduced with regards to AI governance. And interestingly, these principles included harmony and friendliness, fairness and justice, inclusiveness and sharing, respect for privacy, security and controllability, shared responsibility, open collaboration, and agile governance. This was the development in China until 2019. Beg your pardon, for some reason my present, now it's going. And turning to the US now, US was obviously also an early starter in this context. We are looking back at the year 2016. In October 2016, the National Artificial Intelligence Research and Development strategic plan was introduced in the United States. American AI initiative has been launched in February 2019. Initially, 7 main pillars for AI strategy have been introduced in the US. The first being a long-term investments in AI research, development of effective methods for human AI collaboration. Third, understanding and addressing the ethical, legal, and societal implications of AI. Ensuring safety and security of AI applications and systems, developing shared public data sets and environments for AI training and testing, as well as measuring and evaluating AI technologies through standards and benchmarks, and finally, better understanding of national AI research and development needs and requirements. Since then, an Algorithmic Accountability Act has been passed back in 2019 in April, and United States regulatory principles were introduced in January 2020. So we see, as far as the development of principles and regulatory development is concerned, European Union is very much not like on the forefront, but at least in time-wise in the same development as China and United States are in general. So turning to the EU now. So what is happening on the European level? The European AI strategy was introduced in April 2018. So Europe was lagging a bit behind also on this front, like looking at the dates only. I'm not touching upon the topics of actual research and development of AI technologies. In June 2018, as a first step on the way to implementation of the AI strategy, a high-level expert group on AI has been appointed by the European Commission. And the high-level expert group started immediately its work and introduced in less than 1 year the first draft of the ethics guidelines on trustworthy AI. So since then, further measures have been introduced last year, but we will look in more details into them in a minute. So coming back to April 2018, as I mentioned, member states signed the EU Declaration on Cooperation on AI and agreed that within this aim, an adequate legal and ethical framework, building on the basis of the EU's fundamental rights and values, including privacy and protection of personal data, as well as principles such as transparency and accountability, were supposed to be ensured. In addition, this process was supposed to contribute to the sustainability and trustworthiness of AI-based solutions. And finally, it was supposed to ensure that humans remained at the center of the development, deployment, and decision-making of AI. And as many of you for sure know, that this human-centered approach is one of the core pillars and features of the European process. So I mentioned already the European AI strategy. Maybe at this context, it's interesting to mention that the public and private investments were supposed to increase up to euro 20 billion per year over the next decade. So 10 years, it just to also to mention the numbers, as they might be interesting in comparison to the US and China. So as I mentioned, in April 2019, the high-level expert group presented ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI. So the main three pillars, according to the high-level expert group, in order to reach trustworthy AI are lawful AI, ethical AI, and robust AI. So these three pillars are further on based on four ethical principles. So the ethical principles comprise respect for human autonomy, prevention of harm, fairness, and explicability. And in order to realize trustworthy AI, the high-level expert group introduced 7 key requirements. First being human agency and oversight, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, societal and environmental well-being, and accountability. With the ethical guidelines, the high-level expert group introduced the so-called trustworthy AI assessment list for self-assessment. It was a rather comprehensive document which was supposed to help developers, deployers, and users of AI technologies to test their AI application and test basically the trustworthiness of AI. Because looking at all those principles, there are, of course, I mean, on the one hand, we understand the terms, but on the other hand, the question immediately arises, what does it mean in practice, and how is it possible to transfer or test these principles in practice? So the trustworthy AI assessment list was a very handy tool, and we at V29 Legal back then thought it would be nice to translate this tool into a web-based application, which would make it even easier for all types of companies who would like to have a look at these criteria and test these key requirements. And we've done so creating a trustworthy AI questionnaire based on the Brighter technology. It's a no-code technology provided by the legal tech startup Brighter here in Frankfurt. So what happened after that? The ethical guidelines which have been introduced underwent a consultation period. In the meanwhile, European Commission presented white paper on artificial intelligence, also titled as a European approach to excellence and trust. Based on the white paper, it was already at least possible to understand and assess which direction is the European Commission going or can potentially go, and what type of questions and measures are contemplated to be introduced on the regulatory level at that stage. So it's the key takeaways, and well, it is a subjective summary, where that the European Commission is going to pursue a uniform approach to AI across the EU, so a similar one in that regard as we've seen, for example, in the context of GDPR. This approach should ensure compliance with existing EU regulations, including, of course, protection of fundamental rights such as human dignity, pluralism, inclusion, non-discrimination, and protection of privacy and personal data, and consumers' rights. On the other hand, it was also clear that the European Commission would like to, or can potentially, adopt a differentiating approach when it comes to different AI applications. Because in the white paper, one could see that the Commission is differentiating between different levels of risks and might suggest different measures for different risk applications. In June 2020, the so-called consultation period to the EC white paper has been closed. There was a great participation in this public consultation. Majority of participants, 95%, responded to the section on the regulatory options for artificial intelligence, which shows the importance of this step and of the emerging regulation for the industry and again, users and deployers of AI technologies. Main concerns voiced in these during the consultation process related to the possibility of breaches of fundamental rights in the context of AI applications, or potential discrimination as a result of AI-based applications. On the 17th July 2020, following the consultation process, the high-level expert group also introduced an updated final version of the assessment list, which was again based on the 7 key requirements which we have previously seen. However, this time, the high-level expert group also suggested to first test to make a so-called fundamental rights test and assess first what type of fundamental rights AI applications might interfere before assessing and proceeding to the assessment of the 7 key requirements. In October 2020, European Parliament was the first actually agency to address potential regulatory framework. In this context, AP's resolution specifically addressed the framework of ethical aspects for artificial intelligence applications. Also the questions arising from civil liability in the context of AI applications, and questions related to intellectual property rights for the development of artificial intelligence technologies. The resolution was passed in October 2020, and it gave also again type of flavor, what type of for the direction and the European legislation might take at the end. So measures included, suggested, including regulations which would aim at reduction of opacity of AI applications, explainability of AI functioning and the decision-making process, specific introduction of specific requirements when it comes to high-risk applications. So again, this differentiating approach when it comes to various AI applications. Introduction of transparency requirements with regards to interaction with AI. Introduction of human contact points for redress systems. Requirements for technical robustness and safety of AI applications. Also require possible introduction of requirements with regards to the quality, origin, and neutrality of training data, specific data protection requirements for AI applications, accountability, liability measures, as well as issues of human control and risk assessment. In addition, and this is something which has been already addressed in the white paper by the European Commission, the European Parliament also suggested introducing ex-ante conformity assessment, possible labeling schemes for AI applications, as well as external regulatory audits and supervision. So this is just distilling possible trends based on the resolution of the European Parliament. It doesn't mean that the European Commission is going to address and implement all of these suggestions. However, of course, it's a strong indication that it would be the case. So as you've seen from this overview, like looking both at so-called self-imposed regulations, for example, by or guidelines and principles suggested by OECD, or even looking at the principles and guidelines introduced in China, the US, and at the European level, we see that there is a number of principles which do overlap despite all the possible differences, cultural differences and political differences, and differences in approaches when it comes to development of the AI, and this alleged global race for supremacy or leadership in AI on a global level. Still, there is a huge overlap and seems to be some common understanding when it comes to core features and principles which should be implemented when it comes to and secured when it comes to application of AI systems. Why is transparency important? It seems in this context that many of the publications or principles are trying to address the so-called opacity black box problem, which is of course directly related with the nature with the nature of the AI applications and AI technologies. And it's not clear how, I mean, we will see how this question will be solved at the European level. It's not easy because obviously complex machine learning models can make it difficult or even sometimes impossible to identify how certain output or decisions have been generated. There is also a question in how far can some information be made transparent when it comes to business secrets. So how are we going to solve this tension between the need for transparency on the one hand, and on the other hand, between the need of like to protect certain data, knowledge and information in order to remain competitive on the side of corporations. And well, of course, transparency is playing a huge role in the context of accountability, traceability, human control and risk prevention, accuracy and prevention of bias, contestability, and action. All of these principles, which we've seen already being addressed by self-imposed principles, but also in other jurisdictions and at the European level. Why it is important, just to name a couple of examples. For example, here, when it comes to autonomous driving, possible accidents, in this context, it's important for the questions of liability, for example, to pursue how certain decisions were made. And for this, it's important to be able to trace, to trace the decision-making process, to trace the information and evaluate the information. It is also important for human control and risk prevention to secure possible interaction between AI systems and human beings. So here it's possible to think of the example with Boeing and, for example, introduction of AI systems. Pilots were allegedly not aware of or not trained about and were not able to disable and gain physical control over systems and the plane. When it comes to accuracy and prevention of bias, here it's possible also to think of applications in healthcare sector, that it's also important to, first of all, for suggestions to be based on accurate data, and also to have a instance of human control in this regard as well. When it comes to contestability and action, here we can think of examples of AI applications in the banking sector, for example, when it comes to the evaluation of credit worthiness of clients, that in order to contest a decision of a bank, for example, a customer would need to understand how this decision has been taken, on what type of data it was based. Otherwise, it's not possible to make an argument and contest certain criteria or aspects of the decision-making process. So let's think now of the existing regulations and possible gaps. Because thinking of the European emerging AI regulation, it is also important to consider, are there already some regulations which might be applicable, and if so, is there still a need for additional regulation? And if so, then again, what type of topics might be addressed by these regulations? So obviously, we've touched upon some of the so-called self-imposed principles and restrictions, already policy guidelines, which have been introduced by a number of corporations worldwide. But there are, of course, existing regulations which might be applicable to AI applications already. One of the examples is, for example, the GDPR. It is one of the examples of those regulations that have been designed without having AI in mind, but it doesn't mean that they are not applicable to AI applications. So we know that, for example, Article 13 to 15 are relevant of the GDPR, are relevant in the context of the automated decision making and contain the so-called right to an explanation. The problem, however, in practice, again, probably because this regulation was drafted not with specific focus on AI, is how should these articles be applied in practice, how to transfer and how to interpret these regulations and these requirements for specific regulations. This means that, first of all, further guidance is required in order to assess whether your AI applications are compliant with the requirements of the GDPR. And in this context, it's, well, first of all, probably important to consult with lawyers, with practitioners that specialize in this context, but it is also very helpful to look for guidance. For example, one of a very comprehensive guidelines has been introduced in the UK last year by the UK Information Commission, and it comprises like different types of information and guidance for various types of employees or like deployers, personnel within the structure of the company, what type of information has to be accessed, evaluated, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the examples where startups and small and medium-sized enterprises can actually look for guidance if they are not yet in the position to afford, for example, legal advice which might be costly depending on the stage. Another example of existing regulation is AI-specific legislation. So, of course, there are other regulatory other regulations which can be applicable to AI applications as well. But Denmark, for example, was one of the very first countries in the European Union to amend a specific AI to implement specific AI legislation. as an amendment to the Danish Financial Statements Act, which introduced mandatory requirements for certain types of companies, large companies and listed companies in that context, which were obliged to introduce into their management reports specific information on companies' policy on data ethics as of 1st January 2021. So, for example, this requirement comprised release of public information about companies' work with and policy on data ethics issues. If such companies do not have a policy for data ethics, then it is required to introduce into the management's report a statement explaining the background for this decision. If asked, the company must provide information with regards to the algorithms deployed by the company and provide the proof that these algorithms live up to transparency requirements. And in case of non-compliance, according to the legislations, companies can be subject to daily fines. So this is an example of fairly soft regulation, probably in comparison to what we can expect, and we will see it later on the European level, but still which requires a tremendous shift and tremendous change possibly for many enterprises, as they will have to start gathering data, documenting certain procedures and include them into the management reports as of 2021. Identified gaps. So as, for example, the example of GDPR showed already that it's not always easy to apply existing regulations to AI applications, but we've seen already EU Commission's reports on safety and liability implications of the AI, the Internet of Things and robotics, as well as the European Parliament's report on intellectual property rights for the development of artificial intelligence technologies, addressing and identifying specific gaps in the legislation. And it is important to pay attention to these identified gaps, because those are obviously, well, potentially areas which will be regulated by the emerging AI regulatory framework. So let's come now to the core topic of today's presentation. So how can SMEs and startups assess trustworthiness of AI applications? Well, first of all, the data I'm going to present to you applies to big corporations as well, but it's important you know, to be aware of those possibilities, because they are first of all accessible and might minimize risks which will arise once the legislation is being passed on the European level and corporations are not prepared, and how to either change their applications or introduce a lot of costly procedures within their companies. So the first and most important tool to be mentioned in this context is the so-called ALTAI, the assessment list for trustworthy artificial intelligence, which has been finalized, adopted and introduced by the high-level expert group. We've seen these 7 key requirements previously already, and the addition, the feature that came with the updated guidelines is a web-based tool. It's a prototype at the moment, but which provides still users, developers, deployers of AI with the possibility to gain understanding what are the what is meant by these ethical principles, by the key requirements, and how to implement them into practice. So this is a very easy to use tool. You can find it at the on the website of the European Commission, you would have to register in order to be able to use it. But once you registered, you can, constantly use, amend, and edit the assessment list, see your own progress, and also, require different employees or stakeholders within your players within your organization to pay attention and take assessment with regards to certain requirements. Also, it is still possible within this context to provide questions or raise any remarks or ideas within the European AI Alliance, which since it is a prototype, might also consider these remarks for something which I think will eventually be the final tool, which will be presented by the high-level expert group. As V29, we have also, based on the same software I've previously mentioned, we've updated and revised the assessment list on trustworthy artificial intelligence, so you can double check that tool as well. On the website v29.tech, you will see the review of the European process, but you can also take assessment of either overall all the key requirements and fundamental rights, or just specific key requirements you are interested in. Another important possibility is, of course, integration of transparency, or at least considering integrating transparency by design. In this regard, it is also very helpful to see what is out there. A lot of organizations are already working on suggestions, and one of them is the draft model process for addressing ethical concerns during system design, which has been introduced by a working group under the auspices of IEEE. So it is also a very, very important tool to be mentioned in this context, especially for developers considering again, implementing ethical aspects by design when designing AI applications from the very beginning. In other solutions which can be observed and development of the market is the emergence of so-called XAI, so explainable AI applications. Here are some of the players, just as an example, which are active in various sectors. For example, Firames is a Frankfurt-based company offering XAI in the financial sector. Sidot is, for example, a Finnish company offering transparency tools for AI applications in public sector, working with municipalities and cities. We have 10 minutes left, so I will quickly summarize. So we still have 10 minutes to discuss possible questions. So to summarize, what are the important takeaways today, and how can, obviously the regulation is coming, and we see it's a global trend. It's coming not only at the European level, but also in other countries. Depending on the use cases, one might have to consider not only national legislation, but legislation in other countries where a system is used or is being deployed, even if a company is incorporated within the EU, for example, and vice versa. So in order to decrease risks and consider potential risks which might arise from the upcoming, the risks are not going to arise from the regulation itself, but there might be some costs involved as a result of adaptation of that regulations. So in order to decrease these risks, AI developers, users, and deployers might consider, first, talking to legal consultants. There are also offerings and different tools, for example, which are available, were made available by such companies as PwC. I've also noticed the trend of creating ethical and advisory boards to monitor external and external processes in this context, which has been picked up by startups and some companies. Integrating transparency by design, looking for tools, guidelines, and suggestions which have been developed in this context as well. And consider deploying SAI, working with explainable AI applications. And finally, I would really encourage you to use available guidelines and tools for self-assessment, especially tool which has been developed by the high-level expert group, the ALTAI, since it is based on this process that has been initiated by the European Commission. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I see that the time is running up, so I'm looking forward to questions, so we'll be happy to answer them.
Yes, thank you, Olga, for your insight. And if you like, you can keep your presentation.
Sure.
Or, yeah, because then you can maybe go back if you like.
Yeah.
Great. So thank you very much for this deep insight. And I have the first question as I'm the moderator. And
yeah.
So what is your opinion concerning AI regulations? Do you personally support AI regulations or not, or whether such regulations should be general or sector specific?
Good question. I mean, there is a tensions, and there are like different opinions in this regard. So I know that there is a strong opposition on the one hand, coming sometimes from users and deployers and developers of AI regulations. On the other hand, we've seen big companies, we've seen Elon Musk calling for more regulation from the government. You know, I'd like to see it as like, if you would compare it with let's say football game, AI regulation is important because it would provide the rules of the game. It would provide for the necessary framework which would enable us to ensure that core values and fundamental values of the society, in our case European societies, are ensured. Also hopefully prevent really like serious risks and infringements which might arise from high risk applications. This is important. At the same time, I think it is also decisive to take a differentiating approach and provide for enough room for development, research and development of AI applications, and not to, you know, just make them mute from the very beginning because of over-regulation in certain areas.
Yes. Okay, now I'm going to the audience. Thank you for this answer. And here comes Marianne Manon. Interesting topic, a question. In countries where human rights are not respected, how can we expect ethical principles will be applied to AI?
Yeah, but I think, you know, like, well, first of all, it's obviously a matter of regulatory framework, but then of enforcement of this regulatory framework. So we've seen that suggestions for AI principles are coming from various places in this world, and places where we might be considering or thinking that human rights, or even have evidence that human rights are not always respected. So of course we cannot, from the European perspective, somehow influence the process, the enforcement process in China, for example. However, depending on the way the European Commission is going to, on the regulation is going to introduce, what is possible is that even Chinese companies offering their AI-based applications in the European Union would have to obey with the European requirements. So this is something which we can ensure at least within the jurisdiction, within the territory of the European Union.
Okay, yes. And here comes Marcelo Reinaldo de Sousa. Sorry when I pronounce names not perfect. Morning, everyone. Morning, it's afternoon. Considering the possibilities of AI autonomous decision based on its own data interpretation, self-conclusion or judgment, how do you see the risk of law interpretation by AI before taking a decision in campus? Do you understand?
No, I didn't understand the second part. So the second part, if you could read out the second part of the question, sorry.
Yeah. How do you see the risk of law interpretation by AI before taking a decision in campus?
I have to apologize if I didn't get it correctly. I just want to maybe like to bring an example of intersection of interpretation, like legal environment and AI applications. For example, in the context of again sports-related disputes, software-based solutions detection systems are deployed, for example, to detect match fixing in football. But again, so for example, if someone, in order to accuse someone of match fixing, it is not enough to evaluate this automated system suggestion that the match, for example, might have been fixed. Another criteria are important to start with. In addition, it is also important in this context, in context of protection before courts or like international tribunals, for example, to be able to understand the decision-making logic and the data this decision has been based upon, even though it is decision of software, right? It's an automated decision. So there are problems and intersections, and until now they are solved by the requirement of, again, human factor and additional requirements or additional factors in addition to automated suggestions by the systems within the justice system.
Yes. Here, thank you. Eleni Eokheim. Regarding business secrets, I think that's interesting because I think SMEs are worried about this. Regarding business secrets, it's a suggestion she asks what you think about. What if, number one, there's an abstract, there would be an abstract questionnaire as a first step with questions like, can you explain how an outcome of your system was taken? And then as a second step, another more detailed level, where a certified person, for example, a trustworthy AI officer, can ask for more details if needed. For example, when there has been a problem with a consumer. This is a good. I think it's a good. The question is, should there not be two levels? You know, like to give the web tool all your secrets is a little bit dangerous.
Yeah. No, I think, well, first of all, like talking about AI applications, talking about different types of technologies. So I do agree that there is a possibility on a general level as a first step to get a general understanding about the technology possible, like learning patterns before going deeper into details. Again, as a litigator, maybe I'm always like thinking of examples from my, from my practice as dispute resolution lawyer. What happens, for example, in international disputes, if two parties are in dispute about certain like patent issues, like sometimes there is like business secrets are at the core of the disputes, or for example, sometimes parties are subject to document production requests and oppose those requests because documents might contain information which is covered by business secrets. And if there are possibilities in such situation to appoint a neutral, be it a judge or an expert, for example, who would have a look at this information, but it's going to be a neutral person, not a opponent, right? Not someone who could benefit from this business secret. And this independent expert could then make a judgment based on the evaluation of this information. So I do think this twofold, two-step procedure might be a viable solution in this context.
Yes. Here comes, sorry, my voice is leaving me. Here comes Taki Muran. Is there any trend on AI regulation applicable within financial systems? What are the main principles that might need to be considered in any future regulation applicable to fintech area?
To fintech. Well, I do. Well, first of all, as far as financial industry is concerned, indeed, it's important to have a look at the number of regulations which are already applicable. Even talking about GDPR, so explainability of certain decisions might be already applicable. So these regulations might be already applicable in this context, right? A consumer might claim its right based on GDPR to explainability. It might want to review the decision to understand what type of data sets or logic has been used when it came to a decision on credit worthiness. So these issues are not, future issues. They are already relevant now. I think they will probably become even more relevant because, at least based on the information revealed so far, again, financial sector is one of the sectors which are seen as a relevant and high risk implications sector within the European context. So yes, if you're a fintech startup, for example, or offering or developing products in this context, I would highly advise you really to keep regulation in mind, because at the end of the day, you don't want to develop something you won't be able to deploy in a couple of months, or you won't be able to get financing for and funding for, because of the potential risks in this context.
Yes, so we are coming to the end of the cafe. I know there are many questions out there, but I think when you have a personal question, or you may also write an email to Olga. I hope you, Olga, you agree. So if people need more insight, more detail, they may approach you directly after that cafe. Is that okay?
Sure. I shared my contact details, should be on screen. You can find me on LinkedIn as well, so feel free to reach out.
Yes, please. And that's, I think it's also the idea of the cafe, that we match people and companies, and if you have more interest, please approach Olga. I think the presentation you may share with us or not. That's again up to you. Do you want to share it? Yes.
I will send it to you. I might have to, probably too big at the moment, but I will make it smaller and share it.
So if you want to have the presentation, please send an email. We want to know who it is, so either to me or to Olga. So please send an email and you will get the presentation, and there will be a recording, as you all know. And the recording will be sent to Olga first. Olga decides, you decide if you want to publish or not, and you tell me then afterwards yes or no. And if yes, you will find it on YouTube, and if no, you don't find it. Very simple. And that's always the same. There's an AI4EU web cafe channel, so if Olga agrees, then it will be there. So again, thank you very much for everybody there, especially Olga, and all the participants and all the questions. It was super interesting, and we could probably fill another hour of question and answers, because it's really, one question goes to the next question basically. And but I hope you enjoyed it, and please come back next week. Next week is an exception. It's Tuesday, not Wednesday, the cafe with Vanessa Clemente from Worldline Mobile Competence Center in Spain. And her talk will be next generation of rewarding system for social networks. So you will get the invitation automatically if you register today. So thank you, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.